She tricked an elderly woman into selling her house for less than it was worth, but she didn't know that the house would get its revenge on her the very next day. Look what happened inside. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're from. Emma Harding had always believed that success belonged to those willing to take it with both hands. For most of her 32 years, she had been reaching, grasping, reshaping her fate with a precision that felt almost surgical. She had grown up in a cramped apartment on the wrong side of the highway, where the walls were thin, the nights too loud, and the idea of a future built on comfort or stability felt like something other people were allowed to dream about. Her parents had done what they could, but money was always short, and necessity had taught Emma early to pay attention to details other people ignored. How old something was, how it broke down, how it could be fixed, how it could be sold. Over time, she'd learned to see the secret language of houses: cracks like veins, floors like ribs, windows like eyelids. And when she discovered the world of flipping, everything clicked into place, as though she'd been waiting for it all her life. By her early 30s, she had built a reputation that traveled quietly but firmly across counties. Investors called her precise. Contractors called her relentless. Competitors called her cold. She didn't mind any of the descriptions. What mattered was the money, and she made it. She bought low, renovated fast, and sold high. Everyone in her circle had a story about how she had managed to negotiate an impossible price or find a hidden structural weakness that shaved thousands off a seller's asking line. She didn't cheat, at least not in the way the law defined cheating. She simply knew how to place herself in the driver's seat of every deal. If people failed to keep up with her, that wasn't her fault. That was business. So when she first heard about the old Woodley house on the edge of Briarbank, she felt the familiar thrill, like a spark behind the ribs. People whispered about that house, in the way small towns always whispered. Softly, half apologetically, as though the story itself might overhear and take offense. They said the woman who owned it, an elderly widow named Agatha Woodley, had lived there alone for decades. They said the house had good bones beneath all that rot, a structure built when builders still cared more about hand-cut beams than speed. They said the property line was strange, grandfathered into some old county regulation that made the land far more valuable than anyone who drove past the weather-beaten porch would suspect. It all sounded perfect, almost too perfect. And to Emma, too perfect usually meant real, because most people never bothered to look closely enough to understand what they had. She drove to Briarbank on a chilly morning in early autumn, the kind of morning where the air already smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet leaves, and the sky carried the color of diluted porcelain. The town unfolded in quiet, uneven stretches: a diner with peeling trim, an abandoned hardware store, a post office that looked older than its own foundation. Dogs barked behind fences. Curtains shifted as people glanced out, noting her unfamiliar car. She pulled onto a long gravel road lined with maple trees, whose leaves had begun to fall in ragged bursts of gold and rust. Then she saw it. The house stood at the end of the road, like a memory half erased by time. A tall, once elegant structure slumped slightly to the right, its porch beams crooked, its windows dusty and dull. The wraparound veranda still held traces of carved woodwork, though much of it had been weathered into soft, unrecognizable shapes. The roof dipped in places like an old man exhaling. The chimney, built of rare stone that Emma immediately recognized as long discontinued, rose with stubborn dignity despite the state of the rest. Her trained eye scanned the structure the way a doctor scans an X-ray. She saw potential under every flaw. She saw the value hidden beneath the rot. Most importantly, she saw profit. The land alone could make her season if she could convince its owner to part with it for the price she wanted. She parked, smoothed her hair, and walked up the creaking steps. For a moment she hesitated, not from fear, but because something about the house suggested that the silence was listening. It was a ridiculous thought, so she pushed it aside and knocked. The door opened slowly, and there stood Agatha Woodley. The woman looked smaller than Emma expected, thin as though carved from linen and bone, with a tidy white braid pulled over her shoulder. Her pale eyes studied Emma with a calm that felt both kind and unsettling. She wore a sweater the color of faded lavender, and held herself with a dignity that seemed to borrow strength from the house behind her. "You must be Miss Harding," she said softly. Emma smiled the professional smile she had polished over years of practice. "Yes. Thank you for meeting with me." Agatha stepped back to let her in. The interior smelled of cedar chests and old books. Dust floated in the light like faint ghosts. The hallway wallpaper had peeled in narrow strips that revealed deeper layers of aging patterns, floral prints from different decades, stacked like quiet chapters in the house's long life. The floorboards groaned under Emma's boots, though the sound felt less like decay and more like acknowledgement. "It's been in my family since 1911, Agatha said as they entered the sitting room. "My grandfather built it with his brothers. All carpenters, all stubborn." Emma nodded as though mildly interested, though in truth she was filing away every detail. Hand-built meant uniqueness. Uniqueness meant resale value. "It has a lot of character," she said. Agatha smiled faintly, as though amused by the understatement. "That it does." They walked through the rooms one by one. Emma noted the sagging beams, the sinking floor near the back door, the cracked plaster, the leaning staircase. She photographed each flaw from angles that made them appear worse than they were, something she'd learned from a mentor years ago. Sellers always accepted a low offer more easily when shown sharp, close-up pictures of their home's weaknesses. As they made their way upstairs, Agatha moved slowly but purposefully, placing her hand on the railing, as though greeting an old friend. Emma watched her movements with impatience tinged with curiosity. There was something reverent in the way the woman touched the house, as if she believed it had feelings. When they reached the master bedroom, Agatha paused by the window. Outside, the yard stretched wildly beneath an overgrown tangle of vines and fallen branches. Yet beneath the ruin, Emma could see the outline of what had once been a beautiful garden. The stone path still held its shape, though leaves covered most of it, and the remnants of a fountain glimmered faintly beneath the moss. It made her think of stories about hidden courtyards that people only rediscovered by accident. "Did your husband work on the house too?" Emma asked, partly to make conversation, partly to gauge whether Agatha had emotional ties strong enough to complicate negotiations. Agatha nodded with a soft, almost wistful sigh. "He did. A craftsman, like my father. He believed you never cut corners. Houses remember when you do." Then she looked at Emma, and something in those pale eyes made Emma feel briefly unsteady, as though the scrutiny had pierced through her polished exterior to something vulnerable beneath. She pushed the sensation away. She knew how to handle owners like this, owners who had attachment, but no practical ability to manage what they had. She didn't lie outright. She shaded truth in the direction she needed it to go. When they returned to the kitchen, she began her practiced routine. She pointed out the water damage above the sink, exaggerating the staining. She touched the loose tile near the threshold, as though it represented a deeper issue. She sighed gently at the cabinetry, suggesting expensive replacements. Then she layered in the technical language: structural compromise, foundational instability, outdated wiring that could pose a fire hazard, plumbing that would likely have to be gutted. Agatha listened without interruption. She nodded occasionally, her eyes drifting over the surfaces, as though seeing the house through two lenses at once: the one Emma offered, and the one she had carried for decades. Emma ended her presentation with a precise, carefully calculated offer. The number she named was low enough to make most people gasp. She kept her voice respectful, as though she hated to speak such harsh truths, but felt obliged. Silence filled the kitchen. For a moment, Emma wondered whether she had gone too far, whether the quiet old woman might surprise her with a sharp rebuke. Instead, Agatha's expression softened. She didn't look defeated. She didn't even look sad. She looked accepting. "If that is what you believe is fair," Agatha said finally. Emma nodded quickly. "It's the best I can do considering the extent of the repairs required." Agatha gave a single slow nod, walked to a drawer, retrieved an old metal tin, and took out the deed. She moved with a calm that felt almost ceremonial. After they signed the paperwork, she let her fingers rest on the countertop one last time, as though saying farewell to an old companion. Then she turned to Emma and placed the key in her hand. Her voice was gentle, but the words carved themselves cleanly into the space between them. "This house always returns what it is owed," she said, "one way or another." Emma blinked, uncertain how to respond. She laughed lightly, uncomfortable with the odd weight of the moment, and slipped the keys into her pocket. "Thank you, Mrs. Woodley. I'll take good care of it." Agatha studied her for a long moment, her gaze almost sorrowful, though not judgmental. Then she stepped outside and descended the porch steps, her figure small against the sprawling yard. She didn't look back. Emma stood in the doorway watching her go. For a moment, she felt an inexplicable heaviness, as though she had stepped across an invisible line she hadn't noticed before. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was simply the unfamiliar sensation of dealing with someone who didn't fight back. She walked back inside and closed the door behind her. The sound echoed faintly through the old rooms, and the house seemed to settle around her, like an animal lowering itself into tall grass. It was an absurd comparison, but she couldn't help feeling it. She explored the house again, mentally redesigning each room, envisioning profit. New paint, modern fixtures, polished floors, opened spaces. The place would shine when she was done. She had plans. She had money to make. She wouldn't let an old woman's cryptic parting words linger in her mind. But that night, as she sat in her apartment reviewing renovation notes, she couldn't stop thinking about Agatha's eyes. They hadn't held anger, or fear, or even resignation. They held knowledge, as though the woman had seen Emma's flaws with unnerving clarity, as though she had known exactly what would come next. Emma closed her laptop. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the window. She turned off the light and lay in bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time she drifted close to dreaming, she saw flashes of the Woodley house, cracked beams, crooked floors, the quiet face of the elderly woman handing her the key, and that strange whisper of a warning. This house always returns what it is owed. She told herself it was nothing, a simple phrase from a sentimental old woman. Yet deep in the quiet space of her thoughts, something uneasy curled into itself, like a seed dropped into dark soil, a seed that, given enough time, would grow. When Emma unlocked the front door of the Woodley house the next morning, she felt a stir of determination push away the strange heaviness that had followed her through the night. There was work to be done, and she intended to begin immediately. She stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind her with a soft thud. The air felt colder than the day before, as though the house had spent the night exhaling something long held inside its bones. Dust motes floated in thin shafts of morning light, twisting gently in a silence that felt almost watchful. Still, Emma straightened her shoulders. She had tamed worse houses than this. There was no time for superstitious nonsense. She dialed her first contractor, a man named Colton, who specialized in structural work. He had agreed to meet her early so they could take an inventory of what truly needed repair. She moved through the living room while she waited, tapping notes into her phone, calculating labor hours, material costs, and potential sale prices. She looked at the beams above, noticing the gentle sag she had pointed out to Agatha. But now that she was committed to the project, she saw it less as a bargaining tool and more as an urgent, expensive problem. A truck rumbled up the gravel outside, and she hurried to open the door. Colton stepped out, his tool belt already strapped on, and a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. He gave the house a dubious look before approaching the steps. "Morning," he said, wiping dust from his boots as he entered. "Place looks historic." Emma tried to ignore the implication. "It has potential," she replied, her voice clipped but firm. "Let's start with the downstairs beams. I want to figure out what needs reinforcement." They walked through the rooms together, but as they did, Emma noticed something strange. It wasn't the decay, she expected that. It was the way the house seemed to reveal new flaws every time she blinked. The peeling wallpaper she had half noticed yesterday now curled sharply at the edges, like brittle parchment. A seam along the baseboard had widened into a dark split. The floor near the window made a faint cracking sound when she stepped on it, a sound she knew with unpleasant certainty she hadn't heard before. Colton crouched near the corner, pushing aside a loose board to examine the joists beneath. He made a low grunt, one she had heard enough times to recognize as a warning sign. "You didn't tell me the rot was this deep." "It wasn't," Emma said before she could stop herself. Then she quickly corrected. I didn't see this yesterday." He shot her a puzzled look. "Rot doesn't spread overnight." But here it was, soft and dark, an ugly cluster of moisture-fed decay that looked almost swollen, as though something had grown rather than crumbled. She knelt beside him, forcing calm into her voice. "Just tell me what it'll cost." He pried back another board, revealing a wider stretch of ruined wood. "A lot. And that's if the joists are the only problem. We need to check the basement." Emma swallowed hard. She hated basements. She hated the smell of them, the claustrophobic closeness, the shadows that clung to corners even at noon. But she followed Colton toward the narrow staircase anyway. The light bulb above the stairs flickered when he tried to turn it on. He muttered under his breath and clomped down the steps with the confidence of someone who had walked into countless questionable spaces. Emma descended more slowly. Halfway down, her hand brushed the banister, and a splinter drove into her palm. She hissed softly, jerking her hand back. A thin bead of blood welled at the center of her palm, bright and sharp against the dimness. She pressed her lips together and kept going. The basement smelled of damp stone and something else, something stale and buried, like forgotten earth. Colton directed his flashlight across the walls, then down toward the support beams in the center. "There," he said, pointing. "See how it bows? That's water damage. Been happening for a long time. You'll need to replace the center posts." Emma forced herself to survey the beam. It sagged just slightly, but enough to threaten the stability of the first floor. "Can it be reinforced?" "It can," he said. "But look over there. That's black mold. And that corner." He pointed the flashlight. "The foundation has a hairline crack that could widen if not handled properly. You'll want to fix that before anything else." Emma's stomach tightened. She could practically feel the numbers stacking themselves like lead bricks in her mind labor hours multiplying, material costs swelling. It was supposed to be her best purchase of the year. Now it seemed determined to chew through profit as though starved for the opportunity. "We can handle it," she said, though the words felt brittle. Colton didn't answer. He was examining a section of wall where the mortar had crumbled enough to expose old stone. He pressed his thumb against it, and a chunk fell away. "This house is fighting you," he said casually. not realizing his words hit her with an unexpected tremor. Emma stiffened. "Don't be ridiculous. It's old." "Old, sure," he replied. "But some houses go easy on you. This one isn't interested." He stood and dusted his hands. "I'll put together a quote. Might take me a day or two. This is gonna be a big job." He left shortly after, driving away down the gravel road, while Emma stood in the yard watching the dust settle. The house loomed behind her, like a silent observer. She turned back toward it slowly, feeling for the first time that its windows looked less like openings and more like eyes. She tried brushing the feeling off. She blamed the lack of sleep, the sting of the splinter still lodged in her palm, the overwhelming list of repairs. But when she re-entered the house, a faint creaking above her head made her pause. It was probably just settling old wood always settled. Yet the sound came again, sharp this time, as if something had shifted its weight deliberately. She climbed the stairs, cautiously testing each step. When she reached the landing, she scanned the hallway. The doors were all where she had left them, nothing out of place at first glance. But as she stepped into the bedroom on the right, she noticed a crack near the ceiling that hadn't been there yesterday. It stretched like a dark vein along the plaster, a thin but unmistakable line. She approached, touched it lightly, and felt the faintest tremor, as if something behind the wall responded to her touch. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Goosebumps rose along her arms. She forced herself to breathe. Nothing was actually wrong. She was imagining things because Colton's words had gotten under her skin. The house wasn't fighting. It was just old. It was just in worse shape than she'd expected. She needed a full inspection. She needed proper planning. She didn't know. Something steadier than the growing unease curling inside her. The rest of the day blurred into a series of small but unsettling failures. The tape measure she carried snapped back unexpectedly, striking her knuckles hard enough to bruise. Her ladder shifted even though she had set it firmly. The bucket of tools she left in the hallway inexplicably tipped, spilling screws across the floorboards. And once, when she stepped into the kitchen, she had the distinct sense that someone had just left the room, that feeling of a presence withdrawing. She turned sharply, but of course no one was there. By evening she was exhausted. She wandered through the house one last time before leaving, telling herself that tomorrow would be better, that she would return with a larger crew and better plans. But as she passed the basement door, she noticed it was ajar. She was certain she had closed it. Standing there, staring into the dark stairwell, she felt a prickling sensation rise along her spine, the same way she felt when walking through construction sites before inspections, where every surface had the potential to fail. She shut the door more firmly than necessary and headed out to her car. Yet even as she drove away, the house stayed with her. It hovered behind her eyelids like a shadow each time she blinked. She told herself it was only stress, only the pressure of a project larger than she had expected, and the shameful knowledge that perhaps, just perhaps, she deserved the difficulties after the way she had secured the deal. That night, she tried to sleep, but her mind refused to quiet. She kept hearing sounds, the creak of beams, the slow groan of settling wood, the echo of footsteps that weren't hers. She replayed her conversation with Colton, then her tour with Agatha, then the moment the elderly woman placed the key in her hand. Houses remember. No, she couldn't think like that. She needed rationality. Focus. This was just a project, a house, a structure of wood and stone that required work, nothing more. Still, when she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with the sensation of walls narrowing around her, beams bending, floors groaning beneath unseen pressure. And somewhere in the deepest part of her sleep, she felt a strange pulse of resentment, not her own, rising from beneath the floorboards of her dream. She woke before dawn, her heart racing. The room was still, but the echo of the house lingered in her mind like a warning she couldn't quite decipher. Tomorrow she would return. Tomorrow she would bring help. Tomorrow she would regain control. But as she rose from bed and looked at the faint red mark still crossing her palm where the splinter had entered, she couldn't shake the thought that the house had reached out first. By the time the third morning arrived, Emma felt as though the house had drained something essential from her. Her sleep had been shallow at best, interrupted by flashes of soundless rooms and dark corners pulsing with unseen tension. She woke long before her alarm, her limbs heavy, her mind clouded. She made herself coffee, though the taste felt thin and metallic. More than once she thought about postponing her visit to the house, giving herself a day to clear her head. But the thought of losing even a few hours to hesitation made her restless in a way that felt almost desperate. She needed to regain a sense of control over the renovation, over the schedule, over herself. So she forced her tired body into motion and drove back toward Briarbank. The morning mist was thicker than usual. It blanketed the road in a pale haze that blurred the world into soft outlines. By the time she reached the old property, the house rose out of the fog like a shipwreck, its silhouette wavering slightly in the damp air. The porch beams looked darker, as though soaked through with last night's moisture. She stepped out of her car and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of wet leaves, cold soil, and something older. Something like forgotten wood that had soaked up too many seasons. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside, feeling again that faint rush of cold that greeted her each time she entered. The house was still, but not peacefully so. It was the kind of stillness that carried expectation, like the hush before a storm. She took a few steps forward, listening for any sign of damage or intruder. But all she heard was the distant tick of the hallway clock she hadn't known existed. She frowned. That clock hadn't been ticking before. In fact, she didn't remember even seeing a clock. Maybe it had been buried under debris and shifted loose overnight. Or maybe she had simply been too tired to notice details the day before. She headed toward the kitchen to lay out plans for the day when a knock at the door startled her. It was firm, but unhurried. A knock of someone who wasn't nervous or impatient. For a moment she froze, her breath catching in her throat with a strange, instinctive tension. No contractor was scheduled to arrive this early, and she hadn't ordered any deliveries. She stepped back toward the hallway, made her way to the door, and opened it. Agatha Woodley stood on the porch. She looked exactly the same as the day of the sale. Composed, steady, wrapped in that lavender-colored sweater, her silver braid resting softly over her shoulder. There was no sign of strain or surprise in her expression. She didn't seem sheepish, nor did she seem angry or accusatory. She simply stood there as though she belonged, as though she had been expected. "Good morning, Emma," she said, her voice soft but clear. Emma blinked, her confusion mixing with the remnants of exhaustion. "Mrs. Woodley, I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" Agatha's gaze drifted past her and into the house, as though she could see through the walls. "I thought I should come by," she replied mildly. "I had a feeling the house might be giving you trouble." Emma stiffened. She didn't want to admit she'd been struggling. She didn't want to confess how overwhelmed she felt, or how inexplicably unsettled she had become. But something in Agatha's tone made hiding seem pointless. The old woman wasn't guessing. She knew. "I've run into a few issues," Emma said carefully. "Unexpected rot, cracked beams, foundation problems. Nothing unmanageable, but more than I anticipated." Agatha nodded once, a gesture that carried neither surprise nor satisfaction, only recognition. "The house was waiting," she said quietly. "It tends to reveal itself slowly." Those words should have made Emma roll her eyes, but instead they drew her in. She stepped aside. "Come in." Agatha crossed the threshold with an ease that felt unnatural for someone who no longer owned the place, as though the house itself welcomed her back. She moved through the living room and toward the kitchen, her hand brushing the banister the way she had before. Her posture was straight, but beneath the surface Emma sensed something else, something like grief or nostalgia, but woven together with steadiness. Emma followed her, unable to shake the impression that the house brightened slightly in the woman's presence. It made no sense, but the air felt less strained somehow, the light a little less cold. Agatha turned to her in the kitchen. "You look tired." Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I am. It's been complicated." "Of course it has," Agatha said gently. "You approached the house with the wrong intention." Emma bristled at that, even though the sting hit a place inside her she had been trying to ignore. "I paid for it. I'm trying to fix it." Agatha's eyes softened with something like sympathy. "You paid for the structure, yes, but you came here expecting to take, not to understand. And houses like this, they resist that." Emma's throat tightened. She thought of the splinter in her palm, the misaligned ladder, the echoing footsteps, the expanding cracks. "I didn't come here to do anything wrong." "No," Agatha agreed calmly, "but you did wrong all the same. You knew it when you spoke to me. I could see it in the way you looked at the walls, the floors. You saw potential profit, but you didn't see the years, the lives, the work. This home was built with care, and it demands care in return." Emma's breath wavered slightly. She wanted to deny it, but the shame that tingled across her skin made denial impossible. "I shouldn't have taken advantage of you." "You took advantage of yourself," Agatha corrected. "You bought something you weren't prepared to honor." Emma swallowed hard. The words struck with painful clarity. All at once she felt exposed, not accused, not judged, but seen. Agatha looked around, her eyes lingering on each corner, as though reading long hidden messages. "My husband," she said softly, "was a craftsman, not merely a builder. He understood houses the way some people understand music or language. He believed in leaving things better than he found them. Always. He used to say the beams remember the hands that touched them." Emma listened, feeling the house settle faintly, as if agreeing. "He taught me," Agatha continued, "how to read the walls, how to know when something must be replaced and when something must be restored. Modern workers tear things out too quickly. They forget that old materials have their own strength, their own voice." She walked toward one of the interior walls and placed her palm gently against it. "This place was never meant to be gutted. It was meant to be guided." The statement made something inside Emma twist part pride, part regret, part reluctant admiration. "You know how to fix it," she whispered. "I do," Agatha admitted. "But you must want to fix it for the right reasons, not because it's profitable, but because it's worthy." Emma stepped closer. "Teach me. Please. I don't know how to do this the way it deserves." For a moment, Agatha studied her face. It was not the calculating look of a negotiator weighing advantage. It was the steady, thoughtful gaze of someone searching for sincerity. And what she found seemed to satisfy her, because the tension in her expression eased. "I will teach you," she said finally, "if you're willing to learn honestly." "I am," Emma said without hesitation. Then quieter, "I need to." The old woman nodded. "Then we start at the foundation. Always the foundation. A house stands or fails there, just as people do." Together they went into the basement, though this time Emma didn't feel the same dread clawing at her chest. Agatha descended the steps slowly but gracefully, and the air, once heavy and stale, seemed to shift, opening slightly. Agatha examined the damaged beam with practiced care, her fingertips lightly brushing the wood, as though listening through touch. "This beam can be saved," she said. "Your worker didn't see it. But it's telling the truth if you know how to hear it." She explained the technique she and her husband used for restoring beams of this age, how certain parts should be reinforced rather than replaced, how old wood responds to treatment differently, how the moisture patterns revealed weaknesses in structure, but not necessarily in integrity. Emma listened intently, absorbing everything. For the first time since she bought the house, the weight on her shoulders eased. The problems didn't feel like traps anymore. They felt like puzzles, solvable with knowledge she had never bothered to learn. When they returned upstairs, the light through the windows looked warmer, brighter. The house itself felt less hostile, as though Agatha's return had softened its posture. There was a long pause between them, filled only by the creak of the old boards under their feet. Finally, Emma spoke. "I lied to you," she said quietly. "Not directly, but I wanted the house so badly I exaggerated its flaws. I manipulated the price. I knew what I was doing." Agatha nodded. "Yes. And now you've seen where dishonesty leads." Emma felt heat flood her cheeks. "I'm sorry." "You're forgiven," Agatha said simply. "Regret is useful if it leads to change, and we have much work to do." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through every room. Agatha pointed out which walls could be salvaged, which materials deserved preservation, and which modern methods would cause more harm than help. Emma felt herself being remade in those hours, not just as a flipper, but as someone who might one day be worthy of restoration work instead of demolition. By the time the sun began to set, she and Agatha stood on the porch together. The fog had lifted, revealing the distant tree line and a sky tinged with orange. The house behind them felt watchful, but not menacing, as though it were waiting, patient and curious. Agatha looked at Emma, her pale eyes thoughtful. "This house will guide you," she said, "if you let it." Emma nodded slowly. "I want to do this right." "Then we begin again tomorrow," Agatha replied, "and the house will show you what it needs." As Emma locked up and walked to her car, she felt something she hadn't felt since buying the property hope. A cautious, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. The house had nearly broken her. But perhaps it had only been testing her, waiting to see what kind of person she would become once the truth was revealed. And as she drove away, she didn't feel watched anymore. Not judged, not warned. She felt accepted. Tomorrow she would return, not as someone trying to conquer the house, but as someone ready to listen. Emma stood at the edge of the yard long after the workers' trucks had rolled away, their engines fading down the bend of the old country road, until the silence swallowed everything again. The Woodley house stood before her in the late afternoon light, its newly repaired siding gleaming softly, its windows clean and bright, the porch steadier than it had looked in decades. It should have felt like triumph. It should have been the moment she could finally breathe. Yet all she felt was a strange, heavy stillness inside her chest, a mixture of exhaustion, guilt, and something softer. A feeling she hadn't expected to encounter again when she bought the house for too little, and said too little to the woman who had trusted her. The conversation with Agatha lingered more persistently than the scent of sawdust and primer. It had carved its way into Emma's mind, the way water carved stone over time. For weeks, she had tried to bury it under tasks, repairs, deadlines, subcontractors, and estimates. But each blow of the hammer, each sheet of plaster replaced, seemed to echo the words the elderly woman had spoken that day on the front porch. Words Emma had dismissed then, but now replayed with the clarity of regret. Houses remember the hands that touch them. Back then, she treated it as superstition. Now, after witnessing the house resist her at every turn, after battling inexplicable changes, collapsing beams, molding walls that seemed to rot overnight, doors that refused to stay closed, lights flickering in rooms where wiring had been checked twice, she could not dismiss the feeling that something deeper had been at work. Not magic, not ghosts, not anything fantastical, but something real, something she had caused. The house had not trusted her, not until she stopped treating it like a transaction. She stepped onto the porch and ran her hand along the railing, feeling the grain of restored wood under her fingertips. A week ago, she had cut her palm on a splinter here, and the wound still marked her skin with a faint, thin line. She remembered how angry she had been then, angry at the house, at the expense, at herself. Now she simply pressed her thumb gently along the healed skin and exhaled slowly, a breath that felt like letting go of something she had clutched too tightly for too long. Inside, the house smelled clean, fresh paint, pine floors, and a faint trace of the lavender oil she had used on the cabinets, because Agatha had once mentioned loving the scent. Sunlight washed the living room in a warm glow. The beams above her head stood straight and sturdy, not bowing like before. The floor didn't creak when she stepped on it. The air felt different, too lighter somehow, less strained. It was strange how a place could change simply because she had changed. She walked through each room slowly, listening, touching surfaces, letting the space settle around her. For the first time since she purchased the house, she wasn't searching for damage or hidden problems. She was simply noticing, acknowledging. The kitchen tile she had chosen gleamed like polished stone. The cabinets stood freshly sanded, varnished, and quiet. She expected to feel excitement after all. The house was nearly ready for listing. Instead, she felt something unexpected, a small ache behind her ribs. She had never kept a house. She had only ever flipped them, selling each before she ever grew attached. Homes were assets in her world. Places to fix, polish, and pass along. But here, standing in the stillness of this old home, she felt a tug she had never felt before. A sense that the place wasn't just a project. It had become something else. A reflection, perhaps, of the parts of her she had avoided for years. Her ambition, her hunger, her mistakes, and now, strangely, her capacity to change. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from Agatha. "Are you at the house today?" Emma swallowed. Her first instinct was to lie, the way she had done too effortlessly when they first met. But she caught herself. She typed instead. "Yes." A moment later came the reply. "I'm coming by. I want to see it one last time." For a full minute, Emma didn't move. Her stomach tightened, and her breath grew shallow. She wasn't sure whether it was fear or guilt or something else entirely. She had avoided Agatha since their conversation, avoided the truth of what she had done, of how she had profited from the woman's grief and desperation. She wasn't ready for forgiveness, and she wasn't sure she deserved it. But she stayed. She waited on the porch, pacing as the sun dipped lower, painting the hills with long, slanting shadows. When Agatha's small silver sedan turned into the driveway, Emma's breath caught. The elderly woman stepped out slowly, her movements deliberate but steady. She wore a soft cardigan and carried a cane, though she didn't seem to lean on it much. When she reached the porch steps, Emma moved instinctively to help her, but Agatha lifted her hand lightly. "I can manage," she said gently. They stood facing each other for a moment, the breeze brushing past them, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant chimney smoke from another home down the road. "You fixed it," Agatha said finally, her gaze sweeping across the new porch beams, the fresh paint, the straightened window frames. Her eyes softened as she looked at the house. It looks the way it should. Emma swallowed, her voice quiet. It took a lot more work than I expected. It always does, Agatha replied, especially after a house feels betrayed. The words struck deep, not because of superstition, but because Emma understood exactly what she meant. Houses were built to be honored, tended, respected. She had treated this one like a bargain, and it had treated her the same way in return. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered before she could stop herself. "I should have been honest with you from the start, about the price, about why I wanted it, about everything." Agatha looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. "We all make mistakes," she said. "It's what we build after them that matters." She stepped past Emma and entered the house. Emma followed, watching as the older woman walked through each room slowly, running her hand along door frames, touching the new walls, pausing in the kitchen where the afternoon light made the tile gleam. There was no anger in her posture, no resentment, only the softness of memory and something like peace. When she reached the window overlooking the yard, she spoke without turning. "My husband built this house with his own hands," she said. "Every board, every stone. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he knew how to build something that could last. When he died, I could not bear to stay here. I couldn't breathe in these rooms. I couldn't open the cabinets he made or sleep near his side of the bed. I sold it because grief made me smaller. And I sold it too cheaply because I wanted to be rid of the pain." Emma listened in silence. "So when you took advantage of that," Agatha continued, "I was angry. But not at you. Not entirely. Mostly at myself. You simply walked into a wound I hadn't healed." Emma lowered her eyes. "But when you came back," Agatha said softly, "and told me the truth, that was the moment the house softened to you." Emma blinked. "You believe that?" "I believe," Agatha said, turning to her with a small smile, "that homes are more than lumber. They are stories. And stories respond to truth." Emma felt her throat tighten, and she looked away, blinking back the weight gathering behind her eyes. After a moment, Agatha continued walking, making her way toward the front door again. Just as she reached the doorway, she paused. "You're a skilled builder, Emma, but you rush, you push, you try to conquer homes rather than listen to them." She turned, her gaze sharp but kind. "If you want to restore houses the way they deserve, slow down. Ask what they need. See the people who lived in them before you touch a single beam. Respect the story, not just the structure." Emma nodded. But it wasn't a simple nod. It was a vow. Agatha stepped outside and descended the porch slowly. Before opening her car door, she looked back. "One more thing," she said. "Don't sell it yet." Emma froze. "Why not?" "Because it's not finished with you," Agatha said. "And you're not finished with it." Then she got into her car and drove away, leaving Emma standing in the fading light, the house behind her warm with the glow of early evening. She turned slowly back toward it, feeling for the first time since she purchased it, not like an interloper or a conqueror, but like someone invited in. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The air felt calm. The floor sat steady beneath her feet. For the first time in her career, she didn't see resale value. She saw a home she wanted to stay in, a home she wanted to earn. And as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows and settled across the room like a blessing, Emma finally understood the lesson she had been too proud to learn until now. Some houses don't need flipping. Some houses flip you. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch our other videos to continue the journey, and share this video with someone who would want to hear it.